Welcome everyone to the 2020 to 2021. Sorry, that was completely wrong. I forgot about the pandemic somehow. To the 2021 to 2022 Anthropology Colloquium series on sense. We've been speaking throughout the year about sensation as a process that is both biological and cultural. And today we really get to think a little bit more about how these two intermesh. So in a second, I will yield the floor to Tad Scher, who will introduce today's speaker. But before I do so, I just want to say, and I think Andrew's already put this into the chat, that we'll handle the Q&A slightly differently this time. So if anyone who has a question could use the raise hands function, and then we will unmute you so that you can actually ask your question. All right, and now to Professor Tad Scher, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lauren. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Tina Lasisi, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Penn State University. She's been working for a number of years with Mark Shriver and Nina Jablonski on issues of human phenotypic variation, but in ways that I think help to clarify rather than muddy the waters with respect to our understanding of the evolutionary and adaptive basis of these features of humans, which have been also the focus of considerable study because within the context of the racial views of human variation. And in fact, our understanding of phenotypic variation has been greatly hamstrung by these kinds of prevailing models of human variation. So what I'd like to do in brief here before introducing Tina directly is to just quote a couple of things from the papers that she's been publishing on both her direct work with regard to unpacking the genetic basis of hair and skin pigmentation phenotypes, but also on issues of race within biological anthropology, because I think this helps to show the range of work that she's doing and some of the issues that we're contending with now to clarify these understandings. So, quoting from at least one of the articles with her colleagues, one of the things that's happened in recent years, and Tina's been one of the persons helping to lead this, is to work with a broader array of diverse global populations and using new methods like sequencing and genotyping and modeling, even studies of ancient DNA, to begin to more greatly appreciate how limited our understanding of the genetic bases of these human phenotypes like skin color or hair morphology have been. And even genes that have been exhaustively characterized in European populations like MC1R, OCA2, SLC24A5, research with other groups aside from Europeans are leading to a much better understanding of the extent to which genetic diversity, but also epistatic interactions between genes and pleiotropy, admixture, global and local adaptations of various kinds, and cultural practices operate in population-specific ways to shape the genetic architecture of skin color and hence also hair color. And we're also understanding how factors like tanning response and barrier function of skin may also have played a very important may play an important role in selection on skin as an organ system throughout human evolution. And part of what Tina is contributing in this novel to all of this is importantly is she's not just doing basic descriptive work of these phenotypes like hair, but actually using a variety of different techniques, including quantitative methods to disentangle factors contributing to hair morphology rather than relying simply on descriptive comparisons between racialized groups or ethnic populations. So with that background, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Lasisi, who's going to present some of her work in a presentation titled Sense and Salience, Measuring What Matters in Hair and Skin. Thank you, Dr. Lasisi, for joining us this afternoon.
And thank you for this lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. And today I am going to be talking to you about hair and skin, and specifically how perception, ideas of salience, and also biased intuition in scientific sense-making have shaped our knowledge of the evolutionary biology of these traits. I think a good place to start is by asking, what does it mean to be human? For evolutionary anthropologists, this question is often asked in the context of what makes humans different from other animals? What makes humans as a species different or unique? and in discussions of human uniqueness, there are a number of traits that frequently come up: bipedalism, a larger brain, et cetera, et cetera. But there's one trait that I want to focus on: our supposed hairlessness. Humans are sometimes referred to as naked apes, and while a lack of body fur does make us stand out from other living apes, it really isn't that unique among mammals. Most mammals are hairy, yes, but there are naked mammals in the sea, naked mammals underground, and even naked mammals above ground in the savanna. So, in my opinion, clearly the thing that makes us weird or special is not our hairlessness, really, but this combination of a loss of body hair paired with the presence of a dense tuft of hair on top of our heads. So thinking of scalp hair and exposed visible skin as markers of our humanness, it's very interesting to think about the fact that these are two traits that are extremely variable among populations. So how do we study these traits scientifically when they are positioned as so central to our identity as a species, yet they're so variable within our species? I think that skin color is a great place to start because it's a great example of what we can gain from moving from a qualitative categorical approach to a quantitative one. Reflectance spectrophotometers, like the one that you see on this image, are really the gold standard for objectively measuring skin pigmentation. These instruments are capable of giving us, among other measures, something called melanin index, which is a proxy for the melanin content of someone's skin. And even though it's used so broadly today, and we sometimes take it for granted as anthropologists, this was not always the way that we discussed skin color, right? A much earlier way of discussing skin color variation involved the literal assignment of colors to races. This simplification of human groups into different types is incredibly limiting for a number of reasons, but one of them being that it glosses over all the variation within groups. And yes, of course, you can learn a lot from comparing and contrasting groups. In fact, that's how we've learned about some fixed genetic variants that explain differences between populations that have been separated for a very long time. But you also miss a lot of variation by thinking not only categorically, but homogenizing across populations. If it wasn't for the use of melanin index, we would not have been able to pick up on the variation within the African continent because they were looked at as homogeneously dark. And yet, despite the existence of an easy, objective way of quantifying skin color, we see the persistence of categorical approaches like the Fitzpatrick scale. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Fitzpatrick scale, it's a classification system used in dermatology. There's a lot I could say about it, but to keep it brief, it was originally developed to categorize white skin, and that was literally how Fitzpatrick framed it, into different phototypes, different types of skin based on their response to solar radiation. And this then evolved and developed into a generalized classification scheme that dermatologists and many others use to describe skin color variation. And what I find so interesting about the Fitzpatrick scale is that the descriptions in terms of type 1, 2, 3, and so forth, they're not enough to allow someone to categorize people. Even with the verbal descriptions that Fitzpatrick himself gave, that never seems to be enough. And so what people have taken to doing is creating visual references to help people classify themselves and their patients. And now I want to show you one of my favorite visual references for the Fitzpatrick skin types. This one here uses a lot of celebrities, and I just want you to note how Brad Pitt is described as a type 3, which is light brown. I think that this is a fantastic illustration of subjective bias for several reasons. But what it illustrates most powerfully is how certain ranges of variation are collapsed while others are expanded. Category names aside, we have people of basically exclusively European ancestry spanning 4 categories, and people who are of African ancestry, African American, Afro-Caribbean, spanning only 2. So we can ask, objectively speaking, is the variation in Europeans twice what that is seen in admixed Afro-descendants? Of course not. In European Americans, we see here that there is less than half of the variation that we see in African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. So on the bottom, the x-axis is different bins of melanin index. On the y-axis is frequency. And then the gray that you see here is the European Americans and the range of melanin indices they have versus African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. So this really teaches us an interesting way about how Eurocentric bias diminishes the variation that falls outside its range of interest. So another way of demonstrating that is that this is the variation in M-index that we see in a sample that I had of people who were of African ancestry, European ancestry, and Asian ancestry. And we see that there is a huge range of variation in those who are non-European. Yet when we convert it to Fitzpatrick skin types, that then completely exaggerates what we find in Europeans. So that's skin color. But how do we talk about hair? This map here is by the Italian geographer Renato Biasutti, and it's an attempt to summarize the distribution of hair textures around the world based on broadly defined ethnographic data. And in the legend, we see terms that are often used in descriptions of hair morphology. Some of these describe a continuum of curvature from straight to curly. Others describe cross-sectional properties like flat, cylindrical, or oval, and others yet seem randomly sprinkled in like short, which is presumably to do with length, coarse, which has to do with the cross-sectional size of a hair fiber. But what is interesting about this is that there are these very different aspects of hair morphology that are paired together in a way that suggests they are inextricably linked from each other, i.e. curly hair always has a flat cross-section, straight hair always has a round cross-section. And some people might think that this is outdated terminology, but I can assure you that this way of conceptualizing hair morphology and ideas about its distribution has remained remarkably stable throughout time. For example, in forensics, hair is considered trace evidence. One of the analyses that's carried out is the so-called determination of racial origin, where a qualitative assessment is made of hair morphology and the observer assigns a racial category to the hair sample. Another field that uses racialized approaches to hair morphology is dermatology. And if you look at this table here, you see that the different descriptions align very closely with what you see on that map. People whose biological race is Black have frizzy hair with flat cross sections. Quote unquote Oriental people are so invariable in having straight hair that it suffices to have one representative. And white people, of course, are uniquely diverse in having a range of hair colors and hair textures. Sarcasm aside, this does demonstrate the consequence of our limited vocabulary. The words that we have to describe hair morphology and honestly even hair color are biased towards describing the European range of variation. And so that really limits how we can study hair. This is also seen in genetic research. So these are all of the methods from recent genome-wide association studies on hair morphology. And this is a lot of text, but we can summarize these into quite simply a 3-point scale of straight, wavy, and curly. Then we have some that have split wavy hair into wavy and slightly wavy, and big curls and small curls. And then there's some who have made the addition of frizzy. But what do these categories even mean? This inability to describe the range of variation that's collapsed within frizzy is the reason that so far hair variation has been ignored in populations that are racialized as Black. So how should we be phenotyping hair texture if we want to be quantitative about it? Well, first, that depends on what level of morphology you're interested in. There's the entire scalp, then the individual hair fiber, but you can also look at the microstructure of a hair fiber or even analyze it on a molecular level. For me, I look at the level of the individual hair fiber and specifically at cross sections and curvature. Curvature describes the spectrum of hair from straight to curly, and cross-sectional morphology includes the variation in shape ranging from round to flat or elliptical, known as eccentricity. But you can also talk about the cross-sectional area, which is usually what people mean when they are talking about coarse hair or fine hair. So if measuring hair is so much better than classifying, why aren't more people doing it? Well, it turns out that existing methods are pretty time-consuming and labor-intensive. So long story short, even though I would love to all bore you to death with my methods development, the summary is that I spent an inordinate amount of time developing new methods for sample preparation of hair fibers, and I also developed an image analysis program that automates the process for measuring various aspects of hair morphology. However, this still takes time. Nothing will be as simple as looking at someone and subjectively describing their hair as, straight, wavy, curly, or frizzy. And a lot of people ask me whether we are getting anything additionally by measuring hair, by putting all of this effort into quantitatively describing this variation. And I would say that evaluating whether this additional effort is worth it depends on who you want to study. Which brings me to populations of interest in genetic studies of hair morphology. From what I could find, most genetic association studies on hair morphology have been done in Europeans. There are a few studies on East Asians, with a few of those samples coming from Southeast Asia specifically. And then samples that I found that were said to be from the US or Australia specified in one way or another that they only considered people of European ancestry. The most diverse sample that I could find was from a 2016 study that looked at hair morphology across admixed Latin Americans. So that gave me some hope that the glaring omission of representation from the African continent might be rectified. Unfortunately, it was not quite what I had hoped for. And the reason for this is in part their phenotyping methods. When I looked a little bit more closely, I found that the way that they phenotyped hair was using a 4-point scale of straight, wavy, curly, or frizzy. And then I found the following statements. Few individuals were scored as having frizzy hair, 2.4%. And these individuals were excluded from the hair shape GWAS. So what happens when you start off with a small sample of this racialized phenotype and exclude it? Well, that means you probably don't have many people of African ancestry to begin with. Now, because frizzy hair is so racialized, the fact that they only had 2.4% people who were categorized as having frizzy hair in their sample made me suspect that they might not have included many people with African ancestry to begin with. And when I checked their sample, that's exactly what it showed. So here you see an admixture plot of their samples across the various countries where they collected or recruited people. And what you see here is that each line is an individual, and the different colors represent the different fractions of various ancestries that they estimated. So the green is Native American ancestry, the orange is African ancestry, and the blue is European ancestry. And as you'll see, there is a shockingly low amount of African ancestry based on what at least my prior expectations would have been of, for example, a Brazilian sample. So knowing that they already started off with a low proportion of African ancestry in their sample, and then they removed everyone who had frizzy hair, that means that they erased everyone who was racialized as Black and whatever range of variation they carried in that phenotype. And this category itself is already very questionable, because what is frizzy hair? I think that the best way to understand this descriptor is as a racialized category that refers to tightly curled hair that is considered to occur naturally only in African populations or others racialized as Black. This idea that frizzy African hair is fundamentally different from other types of hair is reinforced by the not so subtle statements like the one from a 2018 meta-analysis of these genetic studies that says categories 1 and 2 define straight hair, type 3 reflects wavy hair, types 4 to 5 refer to curly hair, typical for people of European ancestry. So curly hair typical for people of European ancestry is doing a lot of work. What does that mean? Well, I'd say that this statement is working to distinguish European curls as fundamentally different from African frizzy hair, rather than the same phenotype on some continuum of curliness. So these categories themselves, what are they based on? Well, they're based on a 2007 paper by L'Oreal, where a L'Oreal team measures quantitatively various aspects of hair morphology to come up with a classification system, which ironically, a lot of people have taken up in the sense that they cite this paper as the ultimate authority on how many categories of hair there are, but instead of actually measuring anything, which is what the L'Oreal methods say you should do, they just look at the categories that they are presented with in the end results and say, well, this just substantiates the existing notions of hair types that we already had. Now, the categories that L'Oreal came up with themselves are problematic. The first question that I would have as somebody who's done this kind of work is, why would you go through the effort of gathering quantitative data like this just to throw things into bins? That's already questionable. But you might also ask, what were the different categories based on? Is there perhaps some natural threshold that becomes apparent? And I would have to disappoint you and tell you that that's not the case. So here is the best quality, highest resolution figure I could find from their paper, where they describe what the different hair types are. So this is a PCA chart, a principal component analysis, and here they're plotting the first and the second principal components. So the first and second principal components are basically the axes of variation that have been calculated to explain the most difference. And so you'll see that the hairs are just falling all across this plot. And there are these seemingly, I would say, unjustifiable circles drawn around random samples. This is how they justify the different hair types. And as you'll see, the variation that's associated with European hair, so on the lower end of the curve spectrum, it's actually a very narrow distribution. If you're looking at all of the things that they have measured and are looking at where most of the variation lies, it's among the categories that are associated with so-called black hair, with frizzy hair. So what could you possibly use as a justification for saying that the variation across any one of these groups is worth the same as these? They don't give one. And so here you see a very great example that you can put forward seemingly quantitative methods that are not based on any clear biological guidelines. At some point here, the scientists have made a decision on what variation matters and what variation can be collapsed. So to say whether the methods that I've used and all the effort that it takes to get this data is worth it, I would say that yes, it absolutely is worth it. I used the methods that I developed on a relatively small sample of individuals of African ancestry. And I was able to do a genetic association, and I was able to replicate 24 genes that were previously reported to have an effect on hair in the genome-wide association literature. Now, even though I replicated findings from other studies, as in I replicated the genetic variants that they had discussed, those studies never would have been able to detect which of the variants they had found were relevant to African hair variation, because they were not able to describe variation in African hair. It would all have fallen under frizzy for them, and you cannot do a genetic association if everyone has the same phenotype. So there's one finding in particular that I want to highlight. And that is a single nucleotide polymorphism on chromosome 20, where previous studies had reported that the C allele was associated with curlier hair. And in our sample, the C allele was associated with higher hair curvature. Now, I realize that to a lot of people, the hype is maybe not very evident, but this is actually really impressive, if I do say so myself, because we were not only able to replicate the same SNP, we were able to replicate the same direction of the effect, which is a great sign that we probably have a real and valid signal of something. And especially when you consider that we found it in such a small sample of less than 200 people. And this just goes to show that even though a lot of genetic association studies value sample size above everything, I would really say, putting the time into carefully measuring a phenotype can actually be helpful from a scientific perspective. It's not just how many people you have in your study, because you will have less noise if you're better able to measure the phenotype of interest. And what I was most excited about in terms of this finding was what we found when we explored the frequencies of the C allele and its alternative around the world. So here you see an allele frequency map showing that across African populations, we see a higher frequency of the C allele. And that's the allele that we found that was associated with higher hair curvature. And across the Eurasian continent, populations have low frequencies of the C allele and are sometimes even fixed for the alternate T allele. That is consistent with the expectations from my sample, because I was looking at an African-European admixed sample where I expected the alleles for increased curvature to come from the African ancestry. But what's really exciting here is that we find a high frequency of this curly allele for these Melanesian populations. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, Melanesians have very tightly curled hair, which has been described as similar to that of many African populations. So the significance here is that we're able to find something that appears to be not purely associated just with ancestry, but maybe even really with this phenotype of interest. And that is being demonstrated by being able to find this higher frequency of this curly allele in another non-African population that has very curly hair. So all of this is just additional evidence that the variation that we're measuring here really does matter. So now that we've discussed issues with phenotyping and the populations that are included and excluded from genetic studies, I want to focus on the evolutionary hypotheses on Scalpare. You may be surprised to hear that there are actually not that many scientific articles out there on the evolution of human scalp hair. That's why I still have a job. When it comes to evolutionary hypotheses of human uniqueness, hair-related literature mostly focuses on human hairlessness. But when it comes to scalp hair, the little that I could find was on what made humans so special in terms of scalp hair was the length of human scalp hair. Now, this idea that human hair is special just because it grows long came up in this 2004 article. Article, I think, is generous because really it was an opinion piece in evolutionary anthropology. Anyway, the authors here insisted that human head hair is not fur because it's long. And this is then cited by Nicholas Wade in his book, which is never a good sign, where he asks, when did you last see a chimpanzee getting a haircut? Human head hair differs from that of apes in that it never stops growing. Silly rhetorical questions aside, this is entirely wrong. First of all, human head hair absolutely does stop growing. Hair has a cyclical growth pattern with different stages. And so there is a growth stage, but it doesn't go on forever. It can be long. When it comes to our scalp hair, it can be 6 years, it can be 7, I've even read up to 10 years. But human hair does not grow forever. It does stop growing. And this initial article prompted a number of people to write in with their pet theories about hair, which mostly focused on it as ornamental. But there is one that is definitely my favorite, where the author writes that truly untended hair implies that the wearer is desperate or insane, and furthermore, has no friends. But please don't hold back. Tell me what you really think. Anyway, a year later, someone finally wrote in to point out the biggest flaw in the original article, which is that they forgot about the existence of non-Eurasian humans, those with tightly curled hair, those whose hair does not reach absurd lengths if uncut. So this is a great example of who are the humans that we think of when we try to explain human evolution. What are the traits that we are considering as uniquely human? In this case, we see that human was being defined in a way that excluded Africans and Melanesians. But what's interesting about these is that they are also all ornamental. And what is surprising in the literature is how sparse the consideration is for a potential role of heat and solar radiation, which honestly would be something that comes to mind a lot sooner than ornamentation if you're thinking about the conditions of early human evolution. We know that humans evolved in equatorial Africa. And so we know that the evolutionary environment of those ancestors would have been one of high solar radiation, which is in line with what we know about the evolution of skin color. Once humans lost their body hair, their skin was the last barrier between them and the sun. And UV radiation can indeed be very damaging. So an epidermis rich in melanin is excellent protection. But UV radiation only makes up a small percentage of total solar radiation. A large proportion of solar radiation supplies our planet with thermal radiation or heat. And that is one of the many reasons that thermoregulation is of concern. Thermoregulation is how organisms keep their bodies within a range of temperatures that they can function. And for humans, the body needs to remain between 35 degrees Celsius and 42 degrees Celsius. So what did early human ancestors do? Well, first of all, they traded in some of those hair follicles for sweat glands. Sweating is the main tool that we have to bring down our body heat. But could there be something more that we could do to protect our brains? Most mammals have fur, even in the savanna, because it offers protection from the sun. A coat of hair can reflect and absorb a lot of solar radiation before it ever even reaches the skin. So with this context, I want to introduce you to some of the work by Peter Wheeler in the 80s. Wheeler did a lot of work on thermoregulation in human evolution, especially as it relates to bipedalism. And one of the things that he discussed in his papers was the potential role for scalp hair in protecting humans from solar radiation. As bipeds, our heads get the brunt of the sun. And so Wheeler looked at the intensity of solar radiation throughout the day, noting that the highest intensity is when the sun is at its highest elevation in the middle of the day. Now, one of the main critiques that he was receiving is that that scalp hair only covers about 10% of our skin. So a lot of people said this is not going to offer any significant protection. It's not going to be enough protection, enough of a difference to make a physiological change. But Wheeler looked at this, taking into account the angle of the sun to calculate the percentage of skin that would be shielded throughout the day. And what he found is that with our bipedal posture, scalp hair can effectively shield up to 40% of our exposed skin when the sun is at its highest peak. In 2014, Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin took this hypothesis one step further by arguing that tightly curled hair, as seen in many African populations, might offer superior protection from the sun. Now, because of the racist misconception that African hair is woolly, there are misguided ideas about this tightly curled hair being insulating and therefore actually a liability to overheating. However, tightly coiled hair is nothing like densely packed wool, which is crimped, not curled, as it forms an infrastructure that you can see leaves a lot of air pockets. And it really just creates maximum distance between the surface of the hair and the surface of the scalp without creating a tight insulating barrier. So I just want to pause here to say that another benefit of developing these quantitative methods for measuring curvature and insisting on quantifying curvature as opposed to having these categorical descriptors, it moves us away from racialized categorizations, which move us away from this significant misnomer of woolly hair. And woolly hair is still used as a descriptor of tightly curled hair. I often like to bring up the existence of this dermatological condition called woolly hair syndrome. And when I bring it up, a lot of people are shocked to find that there is such a racist, quote unquote, medical condition. But this idea that tightly coiled hair is like wool has a long history. And what's really interesting about looking at the literature on woolly hair syndrome is the way that it is racialized in its diagnostic description. So here, this is text and images from a 2017 article that says, in the non-Black races, woolly hair is certainly an uncommon anomaly of the hair structure. And what I think is absolutely fascinating, looking at various articles of woolly hair syndrome, is that for a lot of individuals, there is no other condition. There is nothing syndromic going on. Sometimes they look for it, but the main complaint, or I guess symptom, if you want to call it that, that children come in with, and really it's their parents, is that their child does not have the hair texture that is appropriate for their race, which I really think is fascinating. Now, going back to the evolutionary implications of viewing tightly curled hair as woolly, it really makes me wonder how much of a role has this framing potentially played in neglecting the function of tightly curled hair as protection from solar radiation? Is this why I, in the year 2022, am basically the first person to be looking at this? Now, while I don't have time to go into the work I did in depth, I do briefly want to mention some of the results from experimental work that I did on hair and thermoregulation. And to my knowledge, this work is the first to demonstrate that hair minimizes heat gain, specifically from solar radiation. So when we looked at differences between no hair on the scalp and hair on the scalp, we found that having hair offered a significant reduction in how much heat was being gained on the scalp. And most interestingly, to me at least, we showed that there was a clear pattern between an increase in curvature and a decrease in solar heat gain. So this reduction in how much heat is being gained along with tightly curled hair is important, not just because it's bringing your temperature down, but from an evolutionary perspective, not reaching a particular temperature means that you don't have to start activating that sweating mechanism. Again, that's our only mechanism that we have to cool down our whole bodies. And if you reduce this need for sweating, that brings about some adaptive benefits in the sense that you are not going to need as much water, you're not going to be losing electrolytes. And it's very easy to see how that could be important in an evolutionary scenario. So to bring together what we've discussed, I just want to leave you with some conclusions and things to think about. The most important thing I want to emphasize is that typologies and categorizations, they significantly affect our perception and consequently our ability to generate hypotheses, especially when the wording is misleading. And so I've made an elaborate case for why no one should ever call black hair woolly again, but I want to give another example. Until the 50s and even later, there were people out there who thought it was weird that Negroes had black skin, even though they lived in such sunny climates. And why is that? Well, it's because they considered black skin to be a proven disadvantage. Because do black objects not absorb more radiation than white objects? What's more, they concluded that it was hard to demonstrate any advantage to increased melanin content in the skin, although they did point out that it was a little funny that you had this pattern of darker skin where it was very sunny. And so there is an entire body of literature out there that explores alternative explanations for why dark skin might be functional, looking at microbes and basically everything else. And, you know, it seems a bit silly now, but it's important to remember that not too long ago, this was taken seriously. And there are comparable examples of weird evolutionary hypotheses out there that, in my opinion, are clearly the consequence of people who have a very narrow, limited perspective on human variation. And one of the important things that I think we need to grapple with as biological anthropologists is that we need to do a lot of work to move past these classifications because they are so easy to people. And moving past this habit of classification is going to require new methods, absolutely. Where there are no methods like we see in hair morphology, or not ones that are feasible on a larger scale, we absolutely are going to need to develop them. But when we look at things like skin color, where we have this easy, relatively affordable instrument that we can just point at someone and tell them their melanin index, we really need to think about why stuff like Fitzpatrick skin type still persists. And within that context, I think that that's where we need to realize that just developing new methods is not enough. We also need to critique existing work and explain why categorical approaches to phenotypes are wrong, or various hypotheses that only consider certain groups of human to be human. We need to point those out and explain what the issue is, because otherwise people will keep citing them. And I see this as a necessary spring cleaning that doesn't occur often enough. And I like to tell people to think of it as the Marie Kondo aspect to our work, where if a piece of information does not spark joy, you should get rid of it, meaning critique it, or at least do not uncritically perpetuate it, which is often done. So now to finish off, I just want to leave you with some takeaways. First, methods measure what matters. And that is very evident, especially in methods that only involve the verbal description of various traits, because language can be limiting. And along those lines, samples reflect who matters. If we look at a lot of research that is being done on hair morphology, it doesn't consider that there's any variation worth looking at in African populations or Melanesian populations, because they all appear to be uniformly frizzy to those who are doing the work. A similar thing is seen in research on pigmentation, where early literature was focusing on how MC1R, one of the genes associated with pigmentation, was very homogeneous within Africa, but Europeans were very variable for it, which people said is reflected in all of the variation that Europeans have in hair color. But how much of that has to do with methods again? So both methods and samples are going to be important in being able to expand who is being considered in this kind of research. And then finally, scientific sense making can reflect bias based on a scientist's limited perspective or perception. And that's really what we're seeing with people who are insisting that dark skin absolutely makes no sense in a sunny place, or that what makes humans special is their long hair. So countering all of these issues is going to require that scientists learn that we can't just compete on the marketplace of ideas without critically engaging with knowledge that has already been produced and that keeps being perpetuated within our fields and across disciplines. So that's pretty much it. I want to briefly thank my advisors, collaborators, and funders. And if you feel the need to contact me after this talk, you can find me here. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing your important, scientifically, socioculturally, and politically important research with us today. I also want to leave a moment to thank you for your strong slide game, which we should all be envious of.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And related to that, so the manner in which we'll sort of approach the Q&A is we'll ask people to unmute themselves, but related to that strong slide game, I wonder if you could open up our Q&A by just speaking a little bit to what I would call public anthropology, or what my colleague Morgan Hope calls SciComm, or scientific communication, and how that kind of figures into the way in which you characterize your work for a popular audience, because it's so clear through your presentation today that you're well practiced at this, and this is an important part of your, not only your pedagogy, but your philosophy as to what anthropology actually is.
I'm so glad this is getting recorded, because I am going to take the transcript of everything you said and just put it on my CV so I can sound really, really, really important. Because honestly, the development of this feels like it only came out of me arguing with people on the internet. I think there's an element of certain personalities gravitate towards, you know, needing to tell other people about what it is that you're doing. But I do genuinely now think a lot about accepting opportunities that seem to not move my academic work forward. And I think that that's a dilemma that a lot of academics face, because, you know, we're told there are certain things that matter, there are certain things that are going to be formally rewarded, and what you're doing now is not, I don't want to say not important, although that's exactly what some advisors say. And even my own advisor was, you know, critical of how much time I was spending on, you know, blogs and Twitter and all of these things. And I think that, you know, that's the only responsible thing you can do as an advisor, because you don't know how that's going to pay off. And there are all of these aspects of social media that I even, you know, have to warn some of my peers and, you know, juniors about. It's like, you know, be careful how you put yourself out there, because there's a lot of consequences to this. But I do, you know, think it's important for me to do this, because as far as my work is concerned, I feel like it has a lot of implications across many different disciplines. Just even thinking about dermatology and forensics, especially, I want people to know. I want people to know what the issue is and what the state is with our knowledge, because also a lot of what I've learned is that you'd be surprised at the state of science. I think that we tend to have a lot of faith in science. Like, there's no other way to describe it. We think that, oh, of course scientists will have thought about this. Oh, of course this, of course that. And that's the main thing that I encounter when I talk about my work, is that people say like, oh, I really thought we would have known this by now. And so by exposing that, I'm really hoping to, you know, push people forward into asking questions, knowing that they're not stupid, and knowing that they also can contribute to moving this knowledge forward.
Thanks, Tina. Great answer. I'd like to invite Lauren, my co-host, Lauren Risfit, to ask a question, and then Tad, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Right. And just to point out that we also have a few things in Q&A as we move forward. Tina, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I can't believe that there's something called woolly hair syndrome that is still being diagnosed. Also, the use of Marie Kondo was great.
Thank you.
So you really convinced me that thinking about hair in terms of thermoregulation makes a lot of sense. And I was just wondering what role baldness plays, or this sort of idea of male pattern baldness.
So look, inevitably in any talk that I give, this question comes up, and I have to, you know, tell everyone that evolution and natural selection, they are cruel mistresses. They do not care about you once you have had kids. If you manage to do the offspring thing, that's all that matters. So if you lose your hair after that point, sorry. So that is really, if you want to look for a functional explanation, and you know, adaptation has to be the answer, that's it. But honestly, I'm the person who always says, like, consider spandrels, consider drift. There's a lot of things that just occur because there is no selection against them. And there are some interesting effects of hormones on hair follicles. I think that some of that might explain why certain people go bald. Like, we still haven't published this work, but we found some association between cross-sectional diameter in men and genes that have been associated with baldness before. So we might be able to figure out like the mechanism by which maybe the stem cells in the hair follicles get exhausted. But what's funny is that even if I find that explanation, there will be no reason. The big why will be evolution just doesn't care about you, which, you know, is heartbreaking.
Thanks, Tina. Tad?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, that profound existential thought there. I wonder if you could add, I enjoyed your presentation greatly, and I followed your work. So I'm, you know, obviously been trying to keep track of your progress with the work. I wonder though if you would add, if you would comment on the transformation of hominid behavior and mobility patterns, which may also be part of the story about thermoregulation, which sometimes is not fully integrated with these ideas about hair, the reasons we maintain hair in some parts of our body and not in others. So perhaps you could elaborate that a bit more and what you think this putting sort of a bigger package or story together looks like.
So basically the big picture framing in terms of our hypothesis, how it fits into the big picture of evolution is that currently we think that around 2 million to 1.5 million years ago, when humans became obligate bipeds, no more gallivanting in the trees, just, walking up straight, not, in exposed savanna, that this was around the same time that humans may have started running long distances, which requires certain thermoregulatory adaptations so that we don't overheat. So one of the special things about humans is that even though we are not winning any prizes in terms of sprinting, we are impressive long distance runners. We have this ability, this stamina, but also this ability to not overheat, because that's the issue for a lot of animals. And so what the idea is that a number of changes occurred around that time, which would have included this switch from a lot of hair follicles to a lot of sweat glands. And then at the same time, the question is whether it was even at the same time that humans would have retained hair on their scalps. So that's still an open question. Like, would they have retained hair on their scalps? Was it the case that they lost all of their body hair and then re-evolved hair on their scalps? It's not really clear. What I was hypothesizing is that post this obligate bipedalism, we also see continued encephalization. So we see that hominins are getting larger and larger brains. And the question is, was there maybe some, I forget what the word is for that, but like some limit on human brain size that had to do with thermoregulation. So the brain is very thermosensitive and it's also thermogenic. So was there perhaps a limitation that was released once we had this scalp hair and maybe this tightly curled scalp hair that was even more efficient, that allowed us to keep our brains cool and therewith, evolve these bigger brains? So, putting all of these things together, that might have helped us expand our range. I'm very critical and I do a lot of eye rolling because a lot of these things don't fit together as neatly as we'd hope, right? Because now we know that we have had introgression from Neanderthals and Denisovans, and who knows how long that they were out here. And we don't even know what they would have looked like phenotypically. So like one of the things that I would be incredibly interested in looking at is, once we know what genes are associated with hair, with scalp hair morphology, maybe we can look at ancient DNA and ask, okay, did we share that with them? Was this maybe one of the differences between us once we met? And those are still all open questions. So I hope that was enough context.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, and with that, we're going to open it up to the floor. And just as a reminder, we're technically here through 1:30. We don't always run to that time. I know some of our participants have to teach and so on and so forth, but we'll go as long as we have questions. And we have one question from Dr. Kat Moore. And Kate, I'm going to click allow you to talk so that you might unmute yourself and,
Sure.
and ask Dr. Lasisi directly.
It's great to be able to talk to you directly. What I wondered was that you've done so much important kind of political and social work in the way that you framed your study, but I wonder what you find interesting and the way you want to use these hard-won insights. Like what's your next problem that you want to tease apart?
Ooh, thank you for asking this, because now I get to tell you all about computer graphics. So my big thing that I discovered is that there is a range of computer scientists who do physics-based simulations. And so I did a bunch of, I want to say regular schmegular experiments that involved like, experimental setups to get the results I did about thermoregulation. But what I learned in that process is that I really don't like doing things with my hands instead of sitting in front of a computer screen. And luckily for me, there's a lot of work that can be done to use knowledge that we have of thermodynamics, physics in general, to simulate things on a computer. And so there's, different aspects of things I want to simulate. There's the, thermoregulatory questions where there are simulations for that. But also in terms of hair morphology, we still don't know why hair curls. And this idea of the cross-sectional shape determining the curvature is something that's been, I want to say disproven multiple times. Basically, a lot of people have found evidence that it isn't the case that the flatter your hair is, the curlier it is, or the rounder it is, the straighter it is. However, there's probably certain aspects of cross-sectional morphology that form physical constraints on how hair can move around in terms of just, this is the physics of a rod. And so it turns out that Pixar does this kind of stuff. They have been doing research for like the last at least decade, I want to say 2 decades, on how they can simulate hair. And so I don't know how many of you have seen Brave, but that was the first time that they were able to simulate curly hair. And going into the details of it, they basically had to fudge things because they weren't able to figure it out. They weren't able to make it work. And that's why when you look carefully at Brave, like, human hair doesn't bounce like that. There isn't that much variation. But the funny thing is, what they need to accurately simulate hair is quantitative data. And what do we not have a lot of? Quantitative data. And so long story short, many serendipitous meetings later, I'm actually going to be at Yale starting this fall working with someone in computer graphics who used to be a senior scientist at Pixar. And so a lot of what we started doing is not just on hair, but it turns out that there is this entire anti-racist movement in computer graphics. They've found that they have fallen short as far as being able to represent a diverse range of human variation, both in terms of hair, but also in terms of skin. So that's something apparently that they also are able to simulate. But when they're using frameworks like the Fitzpatrick Scale, things just don't work out right. And so that's the thing I'm most excited about, moving forward on. And then sidebar, one more thing is facial recognition. So that is something that I'm really hoping to incorporate into my future work and teaching, especially to show people that biological anthropology is actually really still super relevant. Like, there's a lot of knowledge that we have of how human variation works that is not out there, that, engineers are not taught. Not big surprise there. And, people who can do machine learning maybe just don't understand biology as well. And they turn to medicine, which, I see why they would do that, but that's not a good source for human variation as well. So like, one of the things I want to do is like, show people like, hey, biological anthropology, that's a good framework for understanding human variation. And where is human variation incredibly important now? In facial recognition, as well as computer graphics.
Kate, do you have any follow-ups to that?
I'm just thinking about the part about the hair in Brave. As a person with quite curly hair, I very much sympathize with your desire to bring some truth to popular culture on for a couple of reasons. But no, thank you very much. It's really interesting to see how you can find an even bigger project in the midst of this, incredible detail. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to call on Morgan Hoke, who has a question.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi Tina, thank you so much. Your talk was amazing. So wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I have a million questions. I'm going to limit myself to one for now, and I'll pop back on if there's time. But I wanted to ask you, I know you've been focused largely on scalp hair, and for good reason, but while we look naked, we still do persist in having a fair amount of body hair, and there's a lot of variation in that body hair, both in terms of like variation in body hair morphology across a single individual and between individuals. So I'm wondering if you have any insights on body hair more broadly that you wouldn't mind sharing with us for now, and then I'm sure I'll pop back up later.
Okay. That's a great question. And so I used to always dread this question because I was like, it's hard enough to get head hair samples. I don't want to be asking people anything that sounds weird. But, you know, obviously this is an important question and people bring it up all the time. And the, you know, very simplistic answer to that is hormones. My interest mainly, like my focus has mainly been on variation associated with ancestry differences with different populations, but an important axis of variation in a lot of species is also sex differences. And so now I actually started working with a student who has an interest in how sex hormones affect gene expression and affect a range of phenotypic variation. And her interest in particular was actually people who are transitioning. And that in and of itself is like a whole range of interesting questions that are very applied and that, you know, show how important it is to have some of these answers even in that context, because for some people to have gender affirming procedures, some of that might include what is your hair distribution going to look like. And so what I am very interested in understanding is how androgen receptors are distributed across the body, and just in general, what is this interaction of hormones, gene expression, and just you know, where in the body things are being expressed at what age. There's just so many different types of variation that are intersecting there, that it makes it a very complex question. And so one of the things is that, you know, in thinking about my answer, I am inclined to say I do not think that there is an adaptive advantage to having body hair in a particular place, because it is very hard, based on the knowledge that I currently have, to imagine what could possibly vary enough that it would make a difference in terms of how much offspring a certain person has over another. I think a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of variation, but not all of it is going to be relevant to your evolutionary fitness. And so what I can imagine is that there are other sex-related phenotypes that are being selected on, and then that hair becomes like this secondary consequence. So adiposity is very highly affected by hormones. And there are much clearer reasons why, you know, being able to have a certain amount of fat might be selected for, as opposed to hair. Like that has, like, you know, probably a much clearer, you know, consequence, especially when you think about brown fat and, you know, being able to actually have some thermogenic value there. No human has enough body hair. Well, actually, let me not say that. In general, most humans don't have enough body hair that it would make a thermoregulatory difference. It just appears to be impressive. And mostly, like, you know, what people are thinking about is pubic hair, obviously, but, you know, the rest of the body as well, and beard hair. And so I think we're really not going to be able to understand, you know, what might have happened there evolutionarily until we know exactly how body hair and hormones are related to the rest of the body, and like really understand it as a system. So I don't know if that answered the question really, but
yeah, I mean, you definitely got at it, and it made me think of like former other questions. Particularly, I'm really fascinated by the variation that occurs in the differences between beard hair and scalp hair in terms of like color. Like you'll get one person with a totally different color beard hair than scalp hair, and that happens in populations like around the world.
Yes.
So there, there's so much.
Yes.
I'm gonna take a beat in case there are other questions, but Andrew, feel free to just call on me as needed.
Absolutely. We can talk pigmentation later because that is even like a whole other range of interesting questions.
I do want to call on Paula Grant, who put a statement in the chat. Paula, would you like to re-articulate that for Tina?
Mm-hmm.
If not, I have a question. Okay, well, I guess Paula doesn't have a question. Let's see. So I wonder if you could, I'm a linguistic anthropologist. So one of the sort of occupational hazards of my profession is sort of definitional criteria. So that we're not talking across one another. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what salience
Oh God.
means to you.
I'm so scared.
Only because this is a question I've been asking. We all, as anthropologists, we have a categorical imperative to study that which is emergent, important, and so on and so forth. But often we don't interrogate what we mean by importance or salience, or as the focus of our knowledge, or the foci of our knowledge production. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you and vis-a-vis biological anthropology are conceptualizing one of the key terms of your talk today, which is salience.
So I do feel on the spot talking about words in front of linguistic anthropologists, but I'll give it my best go. So actually, it's really interesting because I feel like the work that I do, I identify as a biological anthropologist, but most of the time I'm interacting with geneticists, dermatologists, forensics, and they have different priorities. And so a lot of the work that we end up doing and, trying to think of like what's important, what is it that we want to figure out, like we have different priorities. So for me, I've primarily been interested in what we sometimes call normal range variation. So not pathological, like I just want to know human variation because that's how we bioanth people roll. But from the dermatological perspective, of course, what they're interested in is pathology. And forensics, it's a difficult, interesting case. And genetics is then somewhere in between, depending on whether that geneticist cares about medical things or whether they care about evolutionary questions. And so what's funny to me is how pragmatically sometimes people define that. I think that a lot of dermatology and just a lot of medicine has to do with, okay, it's important because first of all, we have a diagnosis for it. And we have X amount of people who are diagnosed with this every however many years. And that's what I can tell NIH when I ask for the big bucks. Not saying that they're, not good. I say things in grants as well, but that is very much like the logic and the structure that they use to say like, that is why this condition is important. It's because X amount of people are dying from it in, this many years, it's affecting this many people. And then from an evolutionary perspective, I am thinking about, okay, what might have been selected for. And the thing is, all of these things are going to interact with like limitations. Like some things you're not going to diagnose because your diagnostic framework doesn't include that or doesn't allow for that kind of variation. And as we saw with like the evolutionary hypotheses, people were thinking about long hair because that was what was on the forefront of their mind. So there is a high amount of subjectivity to it. And then what ends up happening is that you're trying to make the case, depending on your audience, that it's important. And so you're saying, oh, this isn't just like, random noise or random variation or just whatever, we don't care about it. Like this is salient for you because it's answering these questions that you care about. And so it's like, we're setting up the stage for us to make an argument to other people who have control over, is my work going to get published? Is my work going to get funded? Maybe this is all a very like not generous way of conceptualizing it, but I think that's what I see.
Sounds like rhetoric, sounds like ideology, sounds like ethno-metapragmatics from a linguist.
That last one I didn't know, but yeah, I'm going to say that one.
Professor Tad Sure has had his hand up for a little bit, and I think he'd like a follow-up question.
Would indeed, and this does not have to do with metapragmatics or even semiosis necessarily, but although we do have increasingly interesting conversations about those ideas within the range of bio and linguistic anthropology. But what I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about is the role of the immune system with regard to hair and skin function, since the skin is a primary barrier for it protects the body, and it has the immune system is very important for protecting against infection and response to sunburn, and possibly the influence of hormones on how well it functions. It changes over time with age and so forth. What are your thoughts about what role it might be playing in the emergence and persistence and the range of characteristic traits or features, hair and skin and so forth that you're studying?
That's a great question. So recently I've been really extra interested in melanin, and it's such a weird molecule. I don't know if you guys know this, but fun fact, its structure isn't actually fully known chemically because it's a polymer that is very heterogeneous. I always struggle with this word, but it's basically, not only is it heterogeneous, it also has a lot of different functions. And so I recently started reading about melanin and neuromelanin and Parkinson's. And so realizing that it has so many different roles in the body is something that, as somebody who was mainly looking at it for its effects on hair and skin, that's the context within which I was looking at it. But, that's even again, reminding me of spandrels. There are things that are going to have system-wide effects. And so I think probably one of the most salient, things that we can think of is melanin and how it might have body-wide effects. And so one thing in particular is redheads. I love redheads. Did my master's paper on redheads. If there's any in the crowd, love you. And pheomelanin. So a particular form of melanin that is associated with this red color. And not only that, but it also is chemically less stable than eumelanin, which is the brown kind of melanin. And so there's so many fascinating things about it. One thing that they found is that people with red hair perceive pain differently. And it's not that they feel less or more pain, but it's that they are more sensitive to heat pain, like thermal pain versus electroshock stimulation. I know they did some weird experiments. And so that really makes you think where else could that be expressed? What could it have to do with the immune system? Is it going to have consequences in terms of it being more reactive? I don't really know, but based on what I know now, I am inclined to start looking at where else these things are being expressed. And I know I should probably talk about the microbiome, but I'm really not qualified. All I can say is it's probably important.
Speaking of the microbiome, Morgan, did you have an extra question, or is your hand still just raised? I need to be able to, hold on one, there you go. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, my hand's always raised for today. So actually this made me think of another question, and I actually was watching your neuromelanin video recently on Instagram, which, by the way, you guys, I highly recommend you follow Tina on Instagram. She does amazing psychom work. It's fantastic. She's making quite a name for herself.
God.
But this brings up, there's so many good questions about the sort of political implications of your work. But one of the things that I saw in this video and that you've just reiterated is sort of that redheads in fact feel pain differently, not more or less, but differently. But there is that long-standing, very highly racialized and problematic and racist idea that quote unquote Black people feel less pain, right? So how do we sort of toggle, how do we sort of make sense of these differences in some sense that do exist without allowing them to be taken up in the same kind of racialized rhetoric to create, sort of the problems that we've been dealing with and reifying these ideas that have existed for so long?
That is an excellent and very important question. And so there's a few things. I think we need to keep in mind that racists are incredibly good at being racist. I say this in the sense that you can turn anything, into something that is going to be anti-Black. That's definitely for sure. And I'm thinking here specifically of my favorite thing ever, which is white supremacists chugging milk when they found out they had lactase persistence. And the Maasai are literally right there. They are literally right there. The truth, never heard of her, doesn't matter. And even Neanderthals, like I remember reading Svante Pääbo's autobiography of his fears basically when he was doing this work on, okay, which modern populations have archaic hominin, DNA, and his relief at the fact that it was Europeans, because he knew if it was found only in non-Europeans, that was going to have racist consequences. And now what's fascinating is this rebranding of the Neanderthal as, whatever, Renaissance man, and neo-Nazis again, claiming that that's actually the reason for white people being superior, despite the fact that, there's Papua New Guinea, people from Papua New Guinea who have more Neanderthal DNA. But anyway, that doesn't matter. That is not to say that we should be like, oh, whatever, people are gonna be racist. Absolutely not. I think what we've seen recently with the E.O. Wilson scandal is that there are definitely people who do not explicitly seem to, push racist agendas, but some of their work subtly does hint at it. So there are certain things that I, would always say, like, it doesn't make any scientific sense to ask that question, like intelligence. That's not a phenotype, stop. And when it comes to things like pain, I think that, immediately knowing that this question is going to come up is actually fantastic, because that means we can work on it beforehand. So I already knew that, people were going to be like, okay, well, melanin, pain. So what about Black people? Do they feel it more? Do they feel it less? Like, what is it going to be? And, as far as I know, and I'll do more reading into it, but there is no racial association, because again, this variation doesn't go along the lines of race. So, I know that this is not like a great explanation. Part of the reason is I never got around to making that video because I haven't had time. But I think that addressing it beforehand and knowing that it is going to come up is important. And it's important because it gives us an opportunity to answer that question mechanistically, as opposed to only saying like we shouldn't think about race, because that's something that I've also noticed has gone over poorly with a lot of people. Like a lot of my talks, I start off with, okay, we should stop saying race is a social construct, because a lot of people don't understand what that means. Just like totally ethno-meta-pragmatics. That's what race as a social construct sounds like to a lot of people. And we have to be cognizant of that, in that, not offering something to fill the void for them in terms of race is going to backfire. And so, long story short, circling back, what I would say is that we should preempt this and then find what the actual distribution of variation is and offer that as an explanation, so that they have something literally to hold in their hand and they can just drop the racial framework.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Tina. Great answer.
Thank you.
And I would say that linguistic anthropology could use a little bit of SciComm as well. But on that note, thank you, Morgan. And thank you, Tina, for your responses during this Q&A. I just want to turn it over to Professor Tad Short to put a pin in our discussion today and to close things up.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I'm not sure I can do more to say other than what you've already said, that we're in a position now where in the past, we would have been stuck confronting issues of human diversity and issues of hair typology and skin color and so forth, and not necessarily being able to talk about it in a way which is illuminating for our understanding of human diversity. We would be sort of stuck with these old paradigms and so forth. But now we see, and based on in some large part by Tina's work, that we have an opportunity to turn these models on their heads and reconceptualize what human diversity actually is, and abandon these kinds of racial ideas. Not to as you say, Tina, not to dismiss them, and not to talk about their continued resonance in a variety of quarters, but in fact, to sort of take the bull by the horns and really go right at it and say, unpacking all this stuff and say, it just doesn't work anymore. It's not useful. Let's get rid of it and try to find a new way of talking about it. And I think that's really how we're going to advance the field going forward with bioanthro. With all the different ways and having to have those small arguments and all the stuff online and all the semantic issues and things, and also just keep explaining what we mean about GWAS and how you actually, hair morphology, and talk about the fact that Africans are more variable than any other populations in the world, given their continental distribution in Africa, the second continent, largest continent in the world. So all these things I think are extremely important for advancing our field of bioanthro, but anthropology more significantly. So I want to thank you for your presentation, which is greatly illuminating, and for your work on these issues. And hopefully, maybe there'll be some opportunity for us to, perhaps to work more closely with you on some of these issues in the future. But thank you again for joining us for this colloquium.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thanks to